Is your organization ready for Copilot from Microsoft 365? Well, today we're going to go into how you can prepare your organization for it. I'm Jeremy Chapman from the Microsoft 365 team, and I'm joined today by Samson Chan from the Microsoft Purview team. So when you think about Copilot for Microsoft 365, there are a couple things that we want to cover. First, preparing your organization for AI. What does that mean? What are the goals and things that you want to do with it? And then I think it's always good to know the underpinnings of any service and how it works in order to help prepare. So we're going to go into that too. And also the different controls that you have through Microsoft 365 and the admin center there, as well as related admin centers like SharePoint, for example, and OneDrive. And then how you can get to just enough access. After that, Samson's going to go through all the different things you can do in Microsoft Purview to set up additional data protections, data security and compliance, and retention and other controls that you have. And then we're going to go through some key takeaways and resources. So let's get into it. So first off, preparing your organization for AI. Well, what does that mean? Basically, it's about having the right mindset in terms of knowing what you want to do with it, where you can save time, where users will be able to save time in terms of generating content, whether that's in text, images, or other forms with the different tools that Copilot for Microsoft 365 will give you. Now, it's important to kind of realize and understand how those different pieces work to know how you want to set up the right data protections and different controls in place that you'll want to have. So first off, in terms of what Copilot for Microsoft 365 gives you, is really an orchestration of large language models. So in terms of their generative output, combining that with the Microsoft Graph and the data that it can get to and access that's tied to the user's permissions. So it will not access anything beyond what the user has access to. And then it's presenting that through Microsoft 365 apps, either to submit prompts and get responses back, or it can actually get to the different files, maybe from Word or Excel or PowerPoint, et cetera, that you're working on, that you have access to again. So you need that app integration as well. And something recently new to this is the ability to also ground data using current information from the web. So if you've ever used maybe other tools that use generative AI from a training set that might be a year or a few months old, now you can bridge that gap and get current information even for events that have happened recently or happening soon in the future. So other things to remember as part of this are what are the different aspects of the Copilot stack. Again, understanding this is going to help you put the right protections in place for your data. So all the way from the infrastructure layer to orchestration, the orchestration is really where Copilot is differentiated in the fact that it's actually bringing together all of the different pieces that I just showed in terms of the graph in your apps and content from the internet to be able to respond with all of the right information to save you time in terms of what you're trying to create. And that means that there are things that you'll want to have and controls that you'll want to have in place in terms of ensuring the right level of access to information for these different operations. The other thing is making sure that you've got the right pieces in place from an apps perspective, and then making sure that if you want to extend that, you can use things like plugins. We've also got Copilot Studio, and there are also sessions on this topic in the next few days that will go over those topics a bit more deeply than we are today. So one thing I like to do, and I'm kind of, my background is doing Microsoft mechanics and going through the mechanics of different operations and kind of the underpinnings, is I like to explain how the process works in terms of Copilot for Microsoft 365 and what that means from a data retrieval perspective. So I'm going to follow along in terms of what happens when you submit a prompt, because I think understanding this is going to help you then understand in terms of the information retrieval aspects so you can put the right controls and protections in place for that. So if you're in an app, whether that's in the copilot.microsoft.com experience or in any of the Microsoft 365 apps, when you submit a prompt, that basically goes through a process that will first start with grounding. What does grounding mean? Well, that means I'm going to take your prompt, I'm going to interpret that and see what the intent of that prompt is. And if I can retrieve additional information from the sources I'm allowed to go to augment that prompt, to add additional information to that prompt. So some of the things that prompt then can retrieve information from, for example, are if you have plugins, if you have the internet configured to use as a grounding source, if you have other connections through Dataverse or Power Platform connectors to be able to use that information in those systems. We also have the Microsoft Graph itself, which gives you the ability to go to things like SharePoint, OneDrive, your calendar, Teams, if you want to recap a meeting, go into your email inbox, those types of things. And you can also do graph connectors, which essentially allow you to expand the Microsoft Graph to other data sources that can be indexed and added to the Microsoft Graph. And within both of these connectors or plugins, you can also determine who has access to which different data sources at the user or group level as well. So then once the prompt has been interpreted and information retrieved to add to it, then it goes back through Copilot, and this is orchestrating the entire process, which can present the longer prompt, effectively user prompt and everything retrieved, to the large language model, which can then respond back and submit its first response. That then can go back and basically be post-processed so that, for example, if there are things around, say, responsible AI controls, you're trying to do something that maybe is unsavory in terms of what you're asking it to do, for example, those types of things can get filtered out. And in addition to that, if you have controls around, say, data confidentiality, sensitivity of information, et cetera, those additional processes can be performed. Then we can respond back to the user with now a response that has the right protections and controls on it, as well as the right filters in terms of content filters. So you get the best possible response with all the rules that you've set then as an IT or security admin. So let's go through then some of the things that you can do there. So what I want to first go through is the admin center controls that you have in Microsoft 365 that you can do to actually set up some of these different configurations for Copilot for Microsoft 365. So first, we have a Copilot page in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Now that's got some core controls here, and I'll just step through what each of those does. So first, we can see our license state. We can also get to relevant messages in the Message Center and different Copilot for Microsoft 365 resources. Additionally, you see some settings here. First, you can submit feedback logs on behalf of specific users to Microsoft in terms of the Copilot experience so that you have control there also as an administrator of the service to act essentially on behalf of users for that feedback mechanism. Secondly, if you want to go in and manage access for Copilot in Bing, Edge, and Windows, you have the ability to enable that and kind of curate that experience in those other standalone experiences. Now, also, you might want to use Copilot with commercial data protections. That too, you can configure the experience of, and we link you to all the different documents to be able to configure how that will be implemented in your organization. Then, kind of what we're talking about mostly today are all the different controls that you have, most of them in Microsoft Purview, that you can implement as part of this. Now, Samson's going to go through all of these different topics today and show you demonstrations of what each of them do and what each actually means. And then you have the ability to keep the Copilot for Microsoft 365 web content enabled. If you do need to disable that, you have the ability to do that as well. And there are also user experiences on the user side to be able to toggle that on or off. And then there's a link to Copilot for security as well. Next, so when you think about the different controls that you have, there are basically considerations around security, compliance, privacy, and responsible AI. Some of those I mentioned as we were showing the process of how the orchestration works. And these are all things that you'll consider as you get your data estate ready for use with Copilot for Microsoft 365. And it kind of goes without saying that you want to make sure that you're using a zero trust security approach where you're always verifying access. And it also goes without saying you should be using multi-factor authentication for all users, not just your admins, and also phase out password-only authentication. That means that the user of Copilot is verified as the right user with the right level of permissions, and it also helps in terms of any third parties or anyone's trying to access any information in your tenant. That multi-factor authentication is going to stop a lot of those different efforts at the front door. So this is something that we recommend whether you're using Copilot or not. Additionally, from your data estates perspective and for search, you want to make sure also that you've got the right access controls in place, which we'll talk about a lot during this session. But also you want to make sure that you're minimizing things like high privilege identities and also using things like just-in-time elevation for your privileged IDs as part of your rollout and getting ready for Copilot to make sure you've got all the right stuff in place. Those are just a few recommendations. There's a lot more that you can do, but these are some of the main ones that we like to mention and call out as part of the Copilot rollout. So what does getting to just enough access means? Well, that basically means that two users will have different levels of permissions based on what they work on and the data that they need. For example, somebody who works on the sales staff may have content related to just sales in their job role, whereas R&D or research and development might have things around product development. And you kind of want to make sure that the access stays within the two orbs and spheres of those different roles. So that means getting to just enough access for each type of role to do their own job. And the good news is there's a lot of different controls that you can implement to help get you there. The other good news is whether you deploy Copilot or not, you're going to want to put these in place even for search using Microsoft365.com or SharePoint search, etc. So the first thing that you can do as a SharePoint admin is to look through all of your different sites that you have configured. And so, for example, if I look at this list here, I can see that I have human resources. I've got a leadership connection site that is valid for pretty much anyone in the company that's just basically a normal worker to their leadership team. Then I have the leadership team itself that needs to be protected because those are the leaders of the organization. And I might have some other more secret project teams like we've got here for Project Falcon or the Mark 8 project team, etc. So one of the first things that you can do is go through these high priority sites and start to make sure that they have the right level of privilege to them. So what I'll do here is I'll just select, in my case, the leadership team site, just going through one of them. And you can see that this is intended only for the leadership team. So I can see I want to protect it. And then making sure that you go into things like membership and looking at the owners for the group and also the site and making sure that not everyone in the company or a lot of people that shouldn't be there aren't there. So this means you'll probably want to reach out to the people that manage that leadership team and site and make sure that they do a review against the right members of that leadership team and site and make sure that the right controls are in place. Also, things like external sharing, you're going to want to lock down a lot of those things as well to make sure, again, that data can't leak outside of these kind of protected locations that you discover as part of doing this. And you'll work through this list starting with high priority sites and groups. And then after, not too much time, you'll be able to get those with, again, just the right level of access for people to still do their jobs, but not expose additional data in search or via the Copilot process for retrieval augmented generation. So something else that you'll see then as a result of this, I'm going to show you just two different user experiences here. So first off, if I've somebody with access to, say, the leadership team now, I can see the strategic objectives doc that's part of the leadership team. But if I go to someone who's not in the leadership team, maybe they're on a few projects, but they're in a different role, searching then for the exact same string in search will not yield the same results because only the files that you have access to will appear in search. The files that you don't have access to will not. And the underpinnings of Copilot respect those same types of rules in that if I prompt Copilot to reference a file or look up information, it's only using the same access that you have as a user to be able to find information to augment your prompt. Okay, so now one of the easiest ways that you can do this in terms of having the labels, if you've got the right information controls in place, and Samson will go into all the details in a moment about what this looks like and how to implement it, is you can actually at the container level, for example, I've got the leadership team open here, decide to apply a label and controls around that team in order to do label inheritance for any content that's created through in that vessel, in that container of where those files are. So as you can see, I'm going to create a new document. When I do that, immediately you'll see that this has a highly confidential label configured for any new content for that site once I've labeled that container. And then something else that you'll see as part of the Copilot experience then is once you do start to use Copilot and write content, you can see I've got a general label now. I'm asking for a draft of a confirmation using terms from a file that I'll reference that's in a protected location that's got a label on it and protections applied to it. So I'm using the Contoso purchase agreement here, a sensitive document. Once I do that, and if that's in that protected area, it's got the right labels and protections applied to it. The nice thing is that any of the content that's being generated through Copilot will automatically inherit the highest label that applies to that referenced content. As you can see here, I already see the sensitivity label appear and everything's protected even after it generates the content automatically there were no policies in this case that I had to configure for the net new content because it was referencing content that had protections on it in the first place. All right, so now what I want to do is actually hand over to Samson, who's on the Purview team, and he's going to go through all the different granularity of controls and options that you have there.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now, let's look at the compliance controls that's available to use with Copilot. Now, to look at how to protect your data, there are three things that you need to consider. You have to understand what kind of data is being accessed with Copilot. You need to label your data to help tell Copilot what to do with the data. And then you also initially have other things like data loss prevention policy to kind of help prevent oversharing. Because in the end, what the compliance control is to make sure that data that shouldn't be accessible by other people are being monitored. These are the kind of things that we have compliance controls to help you use Copilot securely. So we'll demo a bit more about how to leverage sensitivity label to use with Copilot. Let's take an example of Contoso Electronics, a company that has some sensitive information in SharePoint that store documents. And in this demo, we will look at two different users, Alex and Diego, and see how they interact with Copilot with these label controls. When we say compliance, there's a bunch of solutions such as information protection with sensitivity labels, data lifecycle, e-discovery, and communication compliance. These are all relevant in looking at how Copilot interacts with your sensitive data. Let's look at the structure in SharePoint. And you will see that there is Obsidian, which is a group with a secret project. This project only have access for a few users. There is a special sensitivity label for these data and ensure that those data is protected with restriction copy protection. Again, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, we'll look at more detail on how the label is configured to protect these data in this SharePoint site. So you can see that in here, Alex have access to this SharePoint site, but not Diego. Whereas if you look at other sites like the global sales, this is available for both Alex and Diego. Data is available. There's nothing's encrypted. This is all means. And the difference in the label and the protection is help inform Copilot whether it can access the data. So the different admin controls include classification, sensitive labels, and auto labeling, and how this works and the difference in the experience for Alex versus Diego. And once that's in place, then we can look at other compliance solutions listed here in audit, retention, e-discovery, and communication compliance to kind of see how it understands Copilot interactions. So let's start with the classifier. When you go to the Purview Compliance Center, there is a classifier section where you can define a bunch of specific sensitive terms. So referring back to the earlier project in the project space, the Obsidian is considered a special keyword that we need to monitor. So you go to create a custom sensitive information with a list of keywords, and you can see on the right side here, the keyword list include the word Obsidian for the simplicity of the demo. You can add many other keywords that you want to look at. But in this case, let's just stick with a basic keyword. So any content that has the word Obsidian is what needs to be considered when dealing with Copilot. Now let's look at the labeling and auto labeling, how that relates back to the classifier. So when next we go to the sensitivity label that you need to configure, you will see that there's a special label called Project Obsidian. And in there will be encryption and auto label. And this is how this label will help Copilot use the data securely. If you look at the details of this label, you go to the encryption section of the label, you will see that this label has only viewer permissions, meaning that the user has permission to open and read it themselves, but they're not able to copy the data into a document or an email or other places. And this is important because this is how this helps Copilot to also honor this permission to make sure that Copilot similarly do not have access to this data. And additionally, when the label is getting configured, we can also make sure that this label could be applied automatically when we detect certain information. Refer back to the earlier when we talk about the classifier that look for the specific keyword Obsidian. This is what is being configured in this label is anytime we detect the term Obsidian, the label will automatically apply to documents and emails. And this will also help in cases for Copilot results, which I'll demonstrate later. with all those configuration with classifier labels and auto labeling, let's look at what Alex, someone who has permission to the Project Obsidian site, will interact with Copilot. So here we have the Obsidian site. There's a bunch of documents, and you can see that some of the documents are clearly labeled with the Project Obsidian sensitivity label. And you can see that when Alex tries to open and look at the document, all they have is permission to view. They can't edit. Okay, so far so good. Now, when Alex goes to Copilot and try to use this document, say what's important about what are the documents that are in Obsidian, Copilot would search and look for documents related to this, what is asked. Then it checks to see if these documents that Alex has permission. And so it would automatically, given that it has permission, it would extract it and make sure that it shows and it will references that the data is available. And you can see that the label is inherited automatically. This is not about auto labeling, but just by nature, if the reference documents have labels, it will inherit the highest label into the result earlier to what Jeremy has already demonstrated. So they were just showing a different applications where Jeremy was showing this in Word. Now we're showing this in Copilot chat itself. And mentioned earlier, the label is exactly same coming from the document itself. When you look at the label on the chat and label on the references, you can see the labels all shown here. So there's something as what Jeremy has already demonstrated, that when you use Word instead and you go to say, what is important about this document and give me a FAQ, it would go there. And this is same thing, inheritance will happen. So across different Microsoft 365 applications, that when Copilot references that document in the Project Obsidian, it has a label in it. It will then inherit the label from the document onto the new document that's using that Copilot. And you will get notification that because the data is generated through Copilot, it will get the label automatically. That's a specific case in Copilot when the user is referencing a data that has labeled. Now you may ask, what about the stuff that are not labeled? So what happens if you just ask, give me a short FAQ with Project Obsidian, and it may not reference a document that has any label in it? So what happens is that when the Copilot generates the results in Word, the auto labeling controls come in. As you can see, this result contained the word Obsidian. And so even though the data that was pulled from didn't have any sensitive labels, auto-labeling will automatically determine that, oh, we found something that's important, that's sensitive, so we'll automatically apply the label in it. And so once again, your Copilot generated results protected through sensitivity labels. So that was the experience for Alex. Now let's look at Diego, who doesn't have permission to Project Obsidian. So when Diego tries to access the site, they will be shown that they have no permission to access any content documents in that. Okay, so far. So what if Diego wants to try to use Copilot to extract some information out of this project? Because he heard about this top secret project that's being worked on. So Diego now goes to chat and asks, hey, what is this project about? Because the project is protected, okay, no one going to access. Copilot, again, guarantee, similar to what Jeremy's saying, protect your site. Site permissions is important. Just as besides label protection, the site also has controls to determine whether users have access or not. So since in this case, all the information under Project Obsidian is not available to Diego, Copilot will not be getting that information, and it will safeguard the data from being leaked or overshared to Diego. So those are how sensitive label and other permission interacts with Copilot to control it. Now let's look at the admin controls that will help look at Copilot interaction. So in Audit, for example, all the Copilot interactions will be logged, and it will allow admin to determine how much access has happened, who has happened, what time, what application. And more importantly, there's a section in the audit that's called access resource. What this tells the admin is what are all the other documents that it content email that may be used to generate the Copilot results. And within each document, we will know whether there's a sensitivity label based on the sensitivity label ID field. So this will help admins to determine that, are there some data that aren't labeled that should be labeled, right? They will wonder why is these query results from users using Copilot accessing data that are not having any classification. So this is one way to look at information to help them determine, are data being securely protected through sensitivity labels. Communication compliance. Customer can also use communication compliance to kind of monitor the Copilot interaction to see if they're asking appropriate, inappropriate questions. So they would, for example, want to see, Project Obsidian is a secret project. Are a lot of people asking about this? Are these people part of the project? So you can leverage communication compliance to help monitor and evaluate these kind of interactions and look at the detail what they're asking. And you can choose different locations to see what you're being monitored by picking teams to kind of monitor that those interactions. And then similarly, you can also leverage the sensitive information using the keywords to help monitor that. So these are some of the things going back to earlier on why we're saying classifiers, labels, they are all used throughout all the different compliant and performance preview solutions to help you look at how Copilot is being used. Data retention. Similarly, those Copilot interaction may need to meet your regulatory needs to store, to retain for a period of time. So you can specifically also now create retention policy that will allow you to retain all these Copilot interaction. So once again, we have Teams chat and Copilot interaction as a new way to capture and retain. And back to you, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Samson. So now you've got all of the underpinnings, how Copilot for Microsoft 365 works, how to protect information that's going to be called by those processes in order to augment user prompts and create the right responses. And I would encourage you to check out additional resources that we have. You can go deep on Copilot for Microsoft 365 and all the different purview protections at aka.ms/Copilot data protection. Then we've got some other great guidance around data privacy and security, a site I often go to and refer to almost every day, which is aka.ms/Copilot privacy security. And then going to applying zero trust principles. Again, super important to have zero trust, not only for Copilot, but everything else that you're doing in your organization. So go to aka.ms/Copilot zero trust. And of course, you can check out everything that we do on Microsoft Mechanics and all the different playlists that we have there, not only for Copilot for Microsoft 365 using aka.ms/M365 Copilot Mechanics. We've also covered all the generative AI topics across Microsoft. And if you're into shorter explainers and more animated things, we've also done that too. And you can find that at aka.ms/Copilot explainer. So now you've got all the information you need to protect your information. The ball's in your court, and it's time to deploy Copilot for Microsoft 365.